Thank you, Rory. Thank all of you. It's nice to be on the sort of other side of the podium now, but here I am back at the podium, so I'm not sure if I've gotten totally away from the podium, but that's not my intention in any event. It's also nice to be here in the Hamilton Club. You may remember that one of my priorities in organizing these events was holding them in historic and important cultural and historical venues. And this was the final selection I made as I was stepping down, that we would marry it to the convention, but we needed to still have it in an important cultural, historical venue, and we have one here, and I think it was a great choice to be here and feel sort of part of the history of Lancaster in an important Lancaster place too. This lecture will perhaps you'll experience some horological whiplash after Carleen, because we're roaring back more than 200 years back to the time of James Arthur. Not James Arthur, Edward Duffield. James Arthur was a long time ago, but not quite that long ago. And what you're going to hear is kind of a speech version of the first chapter of the book that will come out next year on this subject. And I actually, I often ad-lib, but this time I actually wrote this all out, so it will make more sense, I hope, and not allow me to forget anything that I wanted to say. So there's a lot of pictures, and I'll probably go by them quickly, but any of them that you really want to see again, just ask me, and I'm happy to share all of these images with you. So I'd like to start with a quote by Alice Winchester. She was the longtime editor of the magazine Antiques. She wrote in the June 1952 issue, "Collectors of antiques are likely to think of clocks as furniture rather than as timekeepers. They pay considerable attention to the case, but little or none to the mysterious mechanism within, though that is actually the clock, and in most cases the only part of the whole thing made by the man whose name appears on the dial. Cases were made by cabinet makers, dials were usually imported, and the product of the clockmaker was the hidden work. It is these complex devices that concern the true clock collector, and the story of their development and the growth of the clockmaking industry in America is a fascinating one indeed." My 80,000 word biography of Edward Duffield will be published within a year. It's the story of a highly skilled 18th century Philadelphia clockmaker born in 1730 and living until 1803. His city and the years that he lived were among the most important in the history of colonial America and of the early United States. Appropriate to the publisher of my book, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, Edward Duffield was elected to membership in that venerable society, founded by his lifelong friend Benjamin Franklin in March of 1768. The next year, Edward was commissioned by the APS to make a highly accurate regulator clock for timing a rare transit of the planet Mercury. This followed shortly after one of the transit of Venus, but it was to observe Mercury's transit. So that floor-standing instrument is one of 3 Duffield clocks and 2 surveying compasses in the collection of the American Philosophical Society. But this is not the story of a typical leather-apron colonial artisan. It's interwoven stories of an affluent 18th century urban craftsman who was deeply involved in the economic, civic, and religious life of Philadelphia. We see his city in 1761. The red arrow shows the important location of Edward's home and shop at the corner of Arch and 2nd Streets. This mechanic was born wealthy. His grandfather Benjamin arrived from England at the time of Philadelphia's founding by William Penn, and he became a wealthy tanner, builder, and property owner. He left much of his estate to his grandson Edward, who was fortunate enough to survive whatever swiftly killed his mother and 4 brothers. All 5 of them died during 12 days in late summer when Edward was just 6 years old. After that tragedy as a youth, he served no known apprenticeship. As an adult artisan, he rarely advertised his wares or services, and he was a member of the city's social elite. He was trusted to sign local paper currency, and he served on public boards and commissions and grand juries. And he was a warden of the city's most important Anglican place of worship, Christ Church, along with many of the city's most prominent non-Quaker leaders. Throughout his life, Edward owned and was taxed on many holdings, including coaches, you see one here from his time period that was made in Philadelphia, rental housing, and enslaved workers. Nominated from England by Benjamin Franklin, Edward, along with Francis Hopkinson, an American founding father, oversaw Philadelphia's Bray Associate School for African American children. A former Bray school in Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, now is being restored. In a letter to the Bray Associates in 1774, Edward reported on the school's students. Quote, "There are at present 2 at their needles and spelling, 1 at knitting, needle, and testament, 7 at spelling, 3 in the testament, 1 in the psalter, 10 in the alphabet, 1 in fables, 3 in the primer. 3 of the above children are free, and the rest of them are slaves." Edward was a practitioner of a highly prestigious trade for a quarter century before our War of Independence. He provided costly clocks, watches, and horological services to the city's prosperous citizens and institutions. But unlike many of his contemporary artisans, he had no financial pressures to endure long hours at arduous tasks, nor was he critically impacted by economic disruptions. He could study, he could work, and he could engage in many unpaid activities without fear of destitution. It seems clear that Edward, at age 45 in 1775, retired from clockmaking when he moved out of Philadelphia. He relocated to his large estate, Benfield, named after his grandfather, about 10 miles north of the city. Perhaps he was like his artisan friends, printer Ben Franklin and cabinet maker Jonathan Gosselow, who each gave up manual labor in their 40s. Edward was ready to leave his workbench behind at about the same middle age. And I'm reminded too, Robert Cheney, when he's heard me say these things, has said, yeah, like most clockmakers and artisans like that, they couldn't wait to get away from the bench. You know, it was hard work, and many other things were much easier. But maybe failing eyesight or physical ailments were factors, but just as likely were other realities in 1775. The growing conflict with Britain that affected both the market for his services and the availability of English supplies, the growing numbers of local competitors, and the lure of healthier, quieter living on his country estate. His wife, Catherine, may also have had a say in the matter as well. Tax records as early as 1779 listed him as a farmer, not a clockmaker. The 1793 document identified him as the late clock and watchmaker. The vocation was not inscribed on his gravestone. His table-style tomb is at the center of my photo. Other family descendants, as you see with those columns, for example, include 2 men who fought on opposite sides of the Civil War. And yet, as a clock and watchmaker for a quarter century, Edward produced some of the finest floor-standing clocks in North America during the 18th century. Several of them are prominently exhibited at world-class institutions, such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Baltimore Museum of Art. We're seeing Colonial Williamsburg, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and this is Winterthur. There's the American Philosophical Society. Here you see one of Duffield's compasses featured in a recent American Philosophical Society exhibit. Other Duffield clocks in elegant mahogany and walnut cases stand proudly at house museums, historical societies, and in private collections. More than 60 are illustrated and described in the catalog section of my book. Here is one fine example, looming over a conference room of the campus of Columbia University in Manhattan. I examined it with my New York City clockmaker friend, John Metcalf. Although Edward never advertised or described himself as an engraver, he produced dies for 2 of the first 2 commemorative medals issued in colonial Pennsylvania and America. Both were created in 1757 and were struck by local silversmiths. The first was an Indian Peace Medal commissioned by Quakers to encourage peaceful relations with local Native Americans. Ironically, the second medal was ordered to celebrate a massacre of Native Americans at Katanning near Pittsburgh. So he applied his engraving skills to both indications of our relationships with the people that were here first. Edward's engraved signature appears on all the clock dials and instruments that are described and illustrated in my book, except for a few examples in block lettering, as on this sundial calibrated for Philadelphia's latitude. The elegant cursive signatures on all look the same. Edward was also well versed in building construction and design, perhaps learned from his grandfather's many ventures in real estate development. Edward inherited and owned many homes and buildings. He was a principal overseer of the raising of Philadelphia's innovative new Walnut Street jail. Ironically, Edward was briefly incarcerated in that jail during the British occupation of Philadelphia. Later in life, he designed the new building for the Academy of Lower Dublin, and that's the only one of his buildings still standing, looking like this when I visited it a few years ago. You see the round opening at the top where a Duffield clock used to provide accurate time for the students and local residents. He also designed his estate's innovative barn that was a model for Pennsylvania stone barns into the next century. A similar stone barn from the same era remains at Stenton, the former mansion of James Logan in Philadelphia. But except for those buildings and the clocks and the instruments bearing his name, they're just shadows, footprints in the sand about the life of Edward Duffield. Intensive research now and in the past has unearthed only a handful of primary materials. No account books, no ledgers, no diaries have surfaced, except for 2 factual reports that he wrote. Account books of other horologists do exist and are fascinating, as we know. Here are entries from later in the 18th century in the records of Samuel Mulligan of Massachusetts. And I'm also at work on a subsequent book about the Mulligan family of clockmakers. And in this ledger entry, we see that he was repairing watches for well-known clockmaker David Wood of Newburyport. My fear, and at the same time my hope, is that a trunk full of Edward's papers will emerge from some descendant's attic just as my book comes off the press. But for now, we know nothing of Edward's upbringing. We know nothing of his education and training or why he chose that difficult trade. There were no clockmakers in Edward's family or ancestry. Neither of his grown sons followed in his footsteps. Benjamin became a respected physician, bravely caring for the sick and dying during Philadelphia's tragic yellow fever epidemic later in the century. More than 10% of Philadelphia's population died in that epidemic. Edward Jr. was a gentleman farmer. This is a miniature portrait on ivory of that younger son, painted in 1790 by James Peale. To my chagrin, this lovely miniature sold at an antique show shortly before I began this project. So I have only this image of the original. But I can propose a reasonable scenario for his horological career. Given his family's affluence, he was not going to be bound to a long apprenticeship under a demanding master, as we heard about David Rittenhouse as well. He probably was privately tutored, as was William Franklin, Benjamin's illegitimate son, who was born just 2 months before Edward. The 2 boys must have been acquainted. There were tutors, advertising, and teaching, as we see in this 1743 notice that was published when Edward was 13 years old. I can speculate that young Edward already began tinkering with his family's watches and clocks. They were affluent and they could have afforded them and almost certainly had them. He may have been drawn to horology through intellectual curiosity, inspired by Ben Franklin's wide-ranging interests, and perhaps as a way to make his own way in the world as more than a well-heeled property owner or general merchant. His father, Joseph, in contrast, was identified simply as a yeoman and does not appear to have had a lucrative trade or major landholdings. Again, some of the inheritance from his affluent grandfather went directly to Edward even when he was a boy. So during past centuries, a passion for horology has slowly or suddenly captured many people. These have included young boys like Henry Ford, as we see in this Norman Rockwell painting, European monarchs like Emperor Charles V and King George III, and thousands of 20th century founders and members of our National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, like the ones we see here gathered in 1957 in Michigan at our national convention that year. All of them were enchanted as I was and am, by beautifully crafted, lifelike machines with ticking heartbeats, shining faces, and gesturing hands. Edward began adulthood in 1751 as an aspiring merchant, selling capers, anchovies, olives, and lemons in the center city, a house that he inherited when he reached age 21. He placed this ad again for the next 2 weeks in August, but he had no more capers. These goods were not locally grown, so Edward was buying them from wholesalers or from ship captains who were importing them from southern climes. Perhaps he already was repairing and fabricating timepieces and instruments as he began his married and working life. He wed Catherine Parry shortly after his 21st birthday. This was uncommonly young at the time. Most young men could not afford to marry until they were financially secure later in their 20s. Edward could have been learning horology from local practitioners like Peter Stretch and his son Thomas, who lived close by, and by practicing diligently on his own. Not until 5 years later, at age 26, was he first identified as a watchmaker. In the local newspaper, he was alerting the public that he had confiscated a stolen silver spoon. Another 6 years passed when at age 32 in 1762, he began maintaining the public clock in the city's State House, now Independence Hall. Edward took over from the clock's maker, Thomas Stretch, who had devised a challenging system of driving the clock dials at each end of the building with long shafts coming from the centrally mounted movement. As we see, the dial at one end of the building was in the form of an oversized tall clock. It's still there today. Edward held this annual service contract for 13 years. We see a 1763 reference to his yearly payment until he passed the job to David Rittenhouse. So you see I have a different image instead of that old chestnut with the telescope, right? There are other paintings by him of him as well. So for his private customer repairs and sales, he had ready access to the city's upper crust from his family civic and church connections. John Cadwallader may have been a customer. We see that prominent gentleman here in 1772 with his family, as again portrayed by Charles Wilson Peale. So here I'll go out on a limb a little bit at the understood risk of imposing contemporary hindsight or presentism. I can speculate that Edward's path may echo my own road to horology more than 2 centuries later. At age 28 in 1980, while working as a speechwriter and press secretary on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., I already had a keen interest in mechanical tinkering, although at that time it focused on old sports cars. When I was introduced to horology and to the NAWCC, I realized that that was a far better pastime for many reasons, staying clean being one. I quickly developed a love for horology that grew until it bloomed into a full-time profession some dozen years later. I was mentored, but never apprenticed. I became adept with study and practice, and with NAWCC friends in workshops and meetings. Of course, Edward had no NAWCC to help him. But no matter how Edward came to clockmaking, we know that he did. We see here an English counterpart in more elegant surroundings and attire. We can assume that for Edward, as for most horologists of his era, repairing, not making, consumed the bulk of his hours. This is one of the very few receipts we have in his own handwriting charging for watch service. In his city, many upper-class homes had valuable clocks, often British imports that were considered superior to clocks made locally. Gentlemen and ladies carried watches. Cleanings and repairs would have provided much steadier work than an occasional order for a new clock. Even if more of Edward's clocks are documented, his sales of new ones could still have been no more than 2 to 5 clocks per year. Regarding Edward's other substantial sources of income, we know quite a lot from public records about his lands, his holdings, and his possessions. We know the taxes he paid. Here we see a 1767 assessment just for his city, not county properties, including 2 Negroes. We know about the public and church bodies on which he served, and the public benefit lotteries and charities that he actively supported. We know the births, marriages, occupations, and deaths in his family, including this sole notice of his wife's passing that was published in 1796. Again, he lived until 1803. But we have only the vaguest hints about Edward himself. There's no descriptions of his height, weight, hair color, demeanor, or voice. We do know what he wore based on pages written by his upscale tailor. Oops, sorry, I've now gone backwards and I didn't want to. Hold on. You're getting now a preview. Good, there's his tailor again. Okay, so this is Joseph Graysbury's account book. It's at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Let's see, there we go. So you don't cheat and look ahead to what's coming. So this account book by his high-end tailor listed 99 articles of clothing, 8 years of purchases between 1765 and 1773 for Edward, his 2 sons, and his Negro man. We may know what he looked like. In 1921, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston purchased a portrait attributed to Swedish-born Pennsylvania artist Gustavus Hazelius. It was inscribed as a likeness of Edward Duffield. But experts later rejected the Hazelius attribution, and then the sitter's identity was questioned because the name was written on a wooden stretcher, not directly on the back of the canvas. I'm not sure why that would make a difference if the stretcher was old, but that was also an issue for them. Anyway, I live near Boston where the museum is, and when I learned about this portrait, I was ready to rush to the museum to see it. And then I was told that was impossible. The portrait had been deaccessioned in 1986. I placed advertisements seeking its whereabouts. But even though that was a great ad, it must have gotten a lot of attention, I had no replies. I did learn that the painting had been in the collection of Edward Duffield Ingram, a grandson of our Edward. It then went to Eli Holden, a prominent Philadelphia watchmaker and jeweler who would have appreciated a portrait of a well-known predecessor in his city. The portrait then came to the Museum of Fine Arts from Eli Holden's heirs. I also placed a more general research advertisement in antiques newspapers, but again I had no responses. More productive was the website I created at the start of this project. This led me to several undocumented Duffield clocks after their owners discovered the website and got in touch with me. Edward also may be the subject of an old drawing shared with me by one of those descendants that contacted me. Their family lore claims that this fellow is Edward, although we know that such passed down stories often get embellished and confused over the years. The drawing accompanied an incomplete Duffield clock movement that the family owned and that they now have donated to the American Philosophical Society. I have an image, but sadly no original, of an undated watch paper like those that Edward pressed into the backs of pocket watch cases. On that little printed paper disc, he called himself a maker and a seller. He stated that there was a dial sign at his shop's location. Please note that he did not say dials with an S. One of the stories that's often told about Edward is that he made a large two-sided clock to hang outside of his shop. Supposedly his friend Ben Franklin suggested it so that Edward would not be constantly bothered by visitors asking the time of day. However, I can find no contemporary reports about this outdoor timepiece as I would expect, given its prominence and its uniqueness. The stories about it appeared much later, and they grew to eventually include even George Washington. If such a prominent clock did exist, it could have looked like this one, photographed recently in England. We see a substantial turret-style movement sitting inside the upstairs room and the twin dials projecting out from the second story. Only 2 letters are known that were written directly to Edward. Neither of them was from his close friend Franklin, who was a great letter writer. In 1765, the minister and colonial secretary, Richard Peters, warmly expressed his great affection for Edward. Peters was a leader of Philadelphia's Anglican congregations, and he was considered the most learned man in the colony. In that letter written from England, Peters wrote to Edward that You have distinguished me in so friendly and open a manner that I owe you everything that love can do where it meets with love. The second known letter to Edward, more businesslike, was from Franklin's sister, Jane Mecom, written after her brother's death in 1790. Several period newspaper advertisements are transcribed in my book to demonstrate the offerings and proliferation of his local competitors. We see Burroughs' Dowdney here, and he paid extra for an illustration of a clock dial to draw attention to his announcement. Spittler's and Bailey's modern reference book lists more than 1,200 watchmakers and clockmakers based in Philadelphia. That book's brief biographies confirm that at least 150 of them were active during Edward's working lifetime. Many competed with him during his adult years in the center city. Trained watchmakers arrived from overseas and clockmakers, such as these two men from Ireland in 1773, who were willing to be indentured to pay for their passage to the New World. More of them, like Ephraim Clark, advertised after Edward's move away in 1775, perhaps validating his decision to leave the field to them. Later on, during George Washington's residency in Philadelphia, our first president frequently stepped into Clark's shop to set his pocket watch. Washington at that time was carrying a Lapine watch that Thomas Jefferson brought back to him from France. Maybe he didn't want to buy English, right? So wanted a French watch, which I guess makes sense. Much more than a Duffield biography, my book explores the nature of clockmaking and watchmaking in the 18th century. At least a half century before Edward's maturity, the trade already relied on divisions of labor and specialist production of finished and unfinished components. Few American or European makers were making clocks from chunks of brass and steel. Even fewer of them had the ability or the tools or the desire to make watches from scratch. Edward had easy access to local and imported horological goods that were much easier to buy than to make. These were equal in quality to parts he could otherwise have needed to cast, turn, scrape, file, drill, and mill by tedious hand labor. His well-known clock movements, one shown here that I restored, differ in no significant ways from movements made by other colonial or British tradesmen. Dissimilarities among his movements, when he more reasonably would have made them the same way from his own templates, can suggest multiple sources for his parts and movements. In my book, I discuss and illustrate Edward's movements and compare them to others. It's easy to see that they are of English style and possibly, at least in part, of English origin. His nearby colleague, John Wood, frequently advertised such imported wares. Again, just a few steps from where Edward lived. I own a tall clock in a Japan case signed by Joseph Harding of London. It dates to around 1760, when Edward also was signing clocks. I compared that movement's components to ones of Edward's that I also completely disassembled. So we see Harding's movement here, and this is the Duffield movement that I disassembled and photographed. Here are photographs of Duffield and Harding's escape wheels. Harding's with the red dot. Edward's rim and crossings are a bit beefier, but otherwise the wheels are nearly identical. And beefier was not necessarily better. I've heard people say, yeah, it's, chunkier, it's got to be better. But clockmakers actually, and I hope those among us that would back me up on this, would often strive to make lighter wheels in order to ease friction and reduce inertia from wheels starting and stopping. George Eckhart, in his classic 1955 book that you see here, reminded us that using outsourced parts was only a start. He wrote that what these men bought was far indeed from a finished clock. Even though a clockmaker could buy parts, his resourcefulness was often taxed. Thus, Edward was likely to have assembled and finished clocks from rough prefabricated components and standard designs. This implies no denigration of his horological skills. I'm not saying he was just a retailer or an assembler or a packager, not in the least. These tasks required substantial expertise, experience, and specialized tools of the trade, but producing an entire movement from raw materials during Edward's years was decidedly old-fashioned and obsolete, especially in major urban settings. Regarding the standard composite brass dials bearing his signature, these generally are indistinguishable from dials that were fit to other makers' movements. Top quality English dials were easily purchased and were difficult to fabricate without different training equipment and materials. In my book, I compare Edward's dials to others from the period that were signed by colonial and British makers. However, I do document 4 very unusual Duffield dials. These have spherical moon lunar indicators. This rare feature is found on a small number of English clocks, such as the 17 London clock by Chandos de Lander and another by John Stevens of Bristol. But Edward's system for rotating the metal globes was different and simpler. I believe he adapted standard dials to his design, and he thus could offer a unique and costly upgrade. I know of no other American clocks with this feature. Another English clock with spherical moon recently appeared, quite recently, at auction. The dial is signed by John Whitehurst of Derby. He was an eminent English horologist and a member of the famed Lunar Society. This small group included men like Josiah Wedgwood and Erasmus Darwin. They met regularly when the moon was full and nighttime travel was safer to discuss science and technology. This clock is hugely important, and I wrote a detailed report about this discovery just in the past April for Maine Antique Digest. The clock descended in Ben Franklin's family and appears to be one of the clocks with rare indicators of local tides that Franklin commissioned from Whitehurst and brought back to America. It's possible that Edward saw Franklin's Whitehurst clock and was inspired to create his own clocks with that rare spherical moon. Franklin visited Whitehurst's home in Derby more than once, and Whitehurst crafted the prototypes of the simplified three-wheel clock that Franklin invented. It was not a successful invention. Kind of hard to tell what time it is. But you see one here signed by Whitehurst that a friend of mine owns and refuses to sell me. So how long he'll be a friend is I'm not sure. But anyway, this is the clock which at least he lent me to examine. So although Edward has been described in a past article as Franklin's clockmaker, actually John Whitehurst more truly deserves that title. And we have to keep in mind, too, that until Parliament's enactment of the infamous, there's John Whitehurst, of the infamous Stamp Act in 1765, there was no Buy American sentiment among the colonists, who of course all were British subjects. In fact, the wealthiest of them had a decided preference for English-made goods. So Edward would have promoted his clocks to his wealthy customers as having substantial amounts of English content and looking quite like imported clocks. He had no incentive, before anti-importation sentiment swelled, to produce and market clocks that did not look English or that trumpeted local origins. And likely nearly all watchmakers today, that title signified a repairer of watches. Very few colonial clockmakers could craft a multitude of tiny parts and create a functional, affordable watch. Nearly all colonial watchmakers sold and serviced English-made watches, like the ones we see here signed by Jabez Baldwin of Salem, Massachusetts. Watchmakers, as we know, engraved their own names, as Jabez did, on the back plates of the imported movements, mostly cased in English hallmarked silver cases. Alice Winchester reminded us at the start of my talk that Edward did not create the elegant wooden cases of his clocks. In Edward's time, the word clock signified only the metal machine and the dial. The case was named separately and ordered separately by the purchaser. Had Edward himself ever written his own autobiography, it would not have been a book about Philadelphia furniture making. However, we can confidently assume that Edward collaborated in the case choices and construction to house his movements and dials. He certainly needed to be sure that his parts would fit properly into the cases being crafted nearby. He may well have discussed with the customers and cabinet makers the choices of woods, the levels of quality, ornamentation, carvings, and turnings, and the delivery and the setup of the finished product. We see here the 1772 confidential, again, you have to be sworn to secrecy still, The 1772 Confidential Philadelphia Price List published to set and regularized what was paid to journeyman cabinet makers in the city. One of its pages, one of its pages indicated prices for clock cases, for making clock cases. We see ones with basic square heads and fancier ones costing nearly double with scroll pediments, frets, and more. The three columns show the prices for using mahogany or walnut and the money in pounds paid to the workmen. Interestingly, the wood cost far more than the labor. However, various options for case feet and base moldings were not mentioned, and clearly there were choices for those as well. Previous authors have claimed that carpentry tools in Edward's 1803 estate inventory, which we do know the contents of, suggest that he built cases. That would have been extremely uncommon. Nothing tells us that Edward had training skills or experience with fine cabinet making. He had several competent furniture makers within shouting distance, including Jonathan Gosselow, who married into Edward's family. The estate inventory listed quantities of oak, white pine, poplar, and sap planks, but significantly no costly walnut or mahogany boards suitable for clock cases. We know that a few years prior to his death, his estate was producing large quantities of wooden barrels, for which his woodworking tools would have been useful. This was documented in Edward's own hand in a pocket-sized 1801 almanac autographed by Edward that I discovered at the American Antiquarian Society near me in Worcester, Massachusetts. In some inner pages, he's making notes about barrel making and what he was paying people to help him make the barrels. In the many handwritten pages of Edward's estate inventory, some typical and expected horological tools and equipment are not present. This strengthens my belief that he did little clockmaking after he left Philadelphia in 1775. In that same year, John Lind advertised that, as you read, he has opened shop at the corner of Arch and 2nd Streets in the house lately occupied by Mr. Edward Duffield, watchmaker, where he carries on the said business in all the various branches. Edward may have sold or given his specialized tools to Mr. Lind, especially lathes, turns, and gear cutting engines that would have been required, but are absent from the 1803 inventory. This is such an engine made around 1760 during Edward's clockmaking years. In the estate inventory, there were also no implements for casting glass plates or wheels. These all would have been difficult for his appraisers to overlook. Past writers also point to 7 clock movements that were in the estate inventory, and they use this to say that he maybe was still doing clockmaking. These included an unfinished musical movement, but without any indication that these were made by Edward or that they had been worked on recently. These may have looked like this standard Duffield movement that's now missing its wooden case. Issues of what Edward made and did not make during his clockmaking years, again, should in no way diminish our appreciation for his fine clocks. We simply must acknowledge the ways that he and his 18th century colleagues needed to operate efficiently and profitably. Edward's name on a clock confirmed to its initial purchaser, as it still does to collectors and admirers today, that the clock was a highly valuable object that he was proud to finish, sign, and sell. His repairing timekeepers, not just making them, also in no way lessens our respect for Edward's expertise. As I personally can attest, there is nothing easy or routine about repairing intricate mechanical machines, ranging from pocket watches to room-sized movements. This was my work table at one point in my life, but perhaps a little more crowded than usual. But even now, as some of you here today may agree, the simplest overhaul can be plagued by malfunctions, errors, accidents, defective parts, lengthy troubleshooting, and the dreaded comebacks days or months later. Edward had even worse repair challenges. He endured poor lighting, minimal magnification, long supply chains, greater variations in available metals, supplies, and parts. There was no Merit's parts catalog back then, and there was no central heating or air conditioning. And unlike repairs of most modern mechanical devices like cars and lawnmowers, clock and watch service requires highly skilled concentration, as we know, not just swapping bad parts for new, An old clock has no output for computer diagnostics. Edward's contemporary colleagues in Pennsylvania face similar repair challenges, as well as issues of how much to make and how much to buy. In my book, I offer comparisons to clocks by Peter and Thomas Stretch, William Houston, Owen Biddle. We see his 1764 ad here. Joseph Wills, this one with rare tide indicators that, as far as we know, Edward never made. And John Wood Jr., seen here in an ad placed by the late dealer Philip Bradley, who, by the way, sold several Duffield clocks during his lifetime as an antique dealer. Outside of Philadelphia, clockmakers were at work as well, although less likely to produce high-style clocks. We see one by Lancaster's, George Hoff, more basic, made during Edward's time. This one, more ornate, in a cherry case with pewter inlay, also was made in Lancaster by Rudolph Stoner. And speaking of Lancaster, I hope that you all have visited or will visit historic Rock Ford, less than a 10-minute drive from here. The gallery is full of early tall clocks, generously donated by the late John Snyder. It's an education on Pennsylvania clocks that were made outside of the Philadelphia area. From England, many clocks and watches by Thomas Wagstaff were imported by his fellow Quaker merchants and customers. Here we see a Wagstaff clock, now at Winter's collection, housed in an elegant mahogany Philadelphia case. Of course, highly ornamental French clocks were being made during Edward's clockmaking years as well, but few of those came to colonial America. Britain discouraged French imports, and Quaker customers would have objected to their high cost and over-the-top golden ornamentation. After the Revolution, more French clocks were brought here by sophisticates such as Thomas Jefferson. We see a French portico clock in his dining room at Monticello. And many of us are familiar with the costly Dubuque figural clocks from the early 19th century honoring George Washington. So, in conclusion, I can tell you that my book is more than a story of an 18th century Philadelphia horology from one craftsman's perspective. It's the stories of a prominent clockmaker, citizen, landowner, and friend of many of the luminaries who helped shape his city and his new nation. Many of Philadelphia's key 18th century events are discussed, not only for context, but because almost certainly Edward witnessed or directly participated in them. For example, the Paxton Boys crisis in 1764, diffused in Germantown by Franklin and colleagues, perhaps including Edward, saw the local militia mustered 2 blocks from Edward's home and shop. And I do have a long quote from David Rittenhouse when he was still out working in the country, complaining about the Paxton Boys going by his house and shooting up the trees and the buildings as they were going by to express their displeasure with then Pennsylvania politics. The 1766 repeal of the infamous Stamp Act was celebrated in Boston with bonfires, banquet for 300 people, outdoor feast for 430 revelers. This is, and they were commiserating with the Boston Tea Party that we see here. It would have been impossible, nearly impossible, for Edward not to have been involved given his location in central Philadelphia and his friendships and family connections and his social standing. We know in 1774 he was on a committee of local mechanics along with David Rittenhouse that were planning responses to the Boston Tea Party. My book's final chapter reveals Edward's close connections with Benjamin Franklin, 24 years his senior. Edward's boyhood home was next door to the family of Edward's wife, Deborah Reed, who we see here. And here's a drawing showing their dwellings in 1723, even before Edward was born. So you see the Reed house right next door to the Duffields. Edward's mother-in-law, Mary Smith, was a dear friend of Deborah Franklin's for 50 years. Edward's sister Sarah married Ebenezer Kinnersley, Franklin's close collaborator with their famous electricity experiments. Franklin's daughter Sally and her family stayed with Edward and his family for extended periods during the Revolution. Edward often sent regards to the Duffields in his letters from London and Paris. There are many volumes of Franklin's letters, and there are several times when the transcription of those letters include sending his regards to the Duffield family. And after Franklin returned to America, the first draft of the Declaration of Independence was discussed by the Committee of Five at Edward's estate, Benfield, when Franklin was resting there in June of 1776. We see Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams conversing. Perhaps Edward, as the host, sat nearby. And I could have included a picture of a silver porringer that was claimed to have descended from Edward, that's at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And supposedly in that meeting, when they first were discussing the Declaration of Independence, Edward served them a terrapin stew in that porringer. So, but that's another one of those hand-down stories by the guy who donated the porringer to the MFA. So we don't know if that enhanced the amount of his tax deduction, but it's possible. So one of three Duffield clocks, one or more of Duffield clocks descended in Franklin's family, although there's no records of Franklin ever purchasing a clock from his friend. As often cited too, Edward was one of three executors of Franklin's will. In that will, Edward also received a French Waywiser, or odometer, from his friend's collection. So the lifelong close friendship between these two men further confirms Edward's importance, not just as a clockmaker, but as a important Philadelphia person in general. So finally, I'm glad to have this opportunity to show a small sampling of the more than 2,300 images I've amassed for this project. I don't have all 2,300 there, but that's a sampling of the pictures I've accumulated. So obviously my book too can include only a small fraction of these pictures. So I thank you for honoring me, both for the years that I served as symposium chair and for selecting me as this year's James Arthur Lecturer. As Rory indicated, I've spent probably decades studying the life of James Arthur. I believe I met Carlene for maybe the first time when I went to the Smithsonian and explored James Arthur's papers that are stored out in their remote storage facility, and found a lot of great things related to James Arthur. My wife later produced a 4-part series in Maine Antique Digest, and totally about James Arthur's life and his legacy and the story of his collections and where they've ended up. There are still, I think, more than 300 James Arthur artifacts at the Smithsonian, so they are not all here in Columbia either. So I hope that James Arthur, like David Rittenhouse up there somewhere, that James Arthur, wherever he is, also is pleased that we continue to honor his generous legacy in this enduring way. Thank you.